the reader comes to a point where, as part of the Haggadah, he says, Rabbi Yossi, the Galilean, used to say, how do you know the Egyptians were stricken by 10 plagues in Egypt and then were struck by 50 plagues at the sea? This is typical now rabbinic exaggeration, but fascinating. And then it goes on. In Egypt, it says, the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. That's the reference to the 10 plagues. At the sea, Israel saw the great hand that the Lord laid against Egypt. And the people feared the Lord. And they believed the Lord and in his servant Moses. Now, the rabbis say, how often were they smitten by the finger? 10 plagues when they confronted Pharaoh. But at the Red Sea, you must conclude they were smitten by 50. Because when Moses confronted Pharaoh, they said, this is the hand of the Lord, or the finger of God. But at the Red Sea, they said, this is the hand of God. So if the finger of God worked 10 plagues, the hand of God must have worked 50. Now, of course, it's an exaggeration. But it's typical of rabbinic exaggeration because they want to just shower us with a sense of the bigness of God and the power of God when it comes to liberating his people. So you see, this is part of Jewish life. And they were reading this as part of the Passover. So when they heard Jesus say, if by the finger of God, whoa, they made that. Not only would they link it to the Exodus, but the second place where the finger of God's mentioned in Deuteronomy. And the Lord gave 2 tablets of stone written by the finger of God. And then in Exodus 31, and he gave to Moses, when he made an end of speaking, with him up Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony and the tablets of stone written by the finger of God. Now remember, Jews would have known, they could have Googled, finger of God, Exodus, Deuteronomy. And now here's Jesus. If I, by the finger of God. And Matthew instantly says, if I, by the Spirit of God. You see, it's the power of God at work, the power of God to set free. And do you see how it's developed? Where the Spirit is at work, the kingdom is present. Because the kingdom of God, as we'll come to see later on, the kingdom is not a political, a geographical entity. The kingdom is the dynamic rule, the reign, the sovereignty, the activity of God. What happens when a person becomes a believer? There's an intrusion of a new power. It is the power of the kingdom, the power of the Spirit, who comes like a new sort of motherboard to change the way we think. And then one final thing, just briefly, because we'll develop later on. Look at the role of the Spirit in the resurrection of Jesus. For Christ also once suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, and being put to death in the flesh, was made alive in the Spirit. Isn't this a very, very powerful phrase? Look at this, especially here at the end. Being put to death in the flesh, who's made alive in the Spirit. Because you see, after his death, after his resurrection, after his ascension, as these last days were inaugurated, how could Jesus fulfill his paradoxical promise? I'm going to be with my Father, but I will be with you. How will I be with you to the end of the age? Well, you see, a physical body would limit him to local presence, but a spiritual presence will allow him, will allow him a kind of a ubiquity he can be in any place. And so, as we'll come to see, as he returns in his Spirit, we enter then volume 2 of that story. Do you remember how Luke begins Acts? In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day that he was taken up. You see Luke's careful use of language. We call this book the Acts of the Apostles. I think that's a total misnomer. It really should be renamed the Acts of the Spirit, or the Acts, the continuing Acts of the Lord. Because Jesus began to do and teach something he would continue to do through the Spirit in the Acts of the Apostles, so that we can sing, "Thank you, O my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving us your Spirit till your work in us on earth is done." So as we kind of reflect together, I think it's both humbling and encouraging to think, if the Spirit was so dynamic, so powerfully present at every point of the life of Jesus, goodness, how much more does someone like me, anyway, just need an awareness of that Spirit in every dimension and every aspect of our lives?